Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Pete, and this afternoon we have another episode of All Things Gout. I'd like to welcome everybody here and remind you that on each Friday, I will release a content video or I'll go live with some type of presentation in regard to gout and how to put gout in remission. Don't forget that in 2016, I was diagnosed with gout. And then in 2019, I was diagnosed with prediabetes. I shifted onto the ketogenic diet. I've put my prediabetes in reversal and my gout is in remission. And part of what I do now is that I'm completely devoted to trying to help gout sufferers put their gout in remission. In today's show, which I call I Have Gout, what can we do to fix that? All right. And we start right now. Okay. I feel pretty strongly, even though I've done this in other presentations, that we have to talk about statistics. About 4% of the US population suffers from gout. This percentage extends to the world population. In the United States, there's between 8 to 9 million of us, depending on whose statistics that you look at. More importantly, and this is the thing, the reason we're going through these statistics is to try and understand what they tell us about gout and uric acid. So we have about 43 million people in the US that suffer from hyperuricemia. So they're walking around with high uric acid. But a significant number of those individuals are never going to suffer from gout. So the first lesson of the statistics is that a gout attack requires more than just uric acid. Yes, uric acid is required for a gout flare, but uric acid in and of itself is not sufficient. There are other factors. This is an important realization as I take you through a review of the gout hypothesis coming up. Next, understand that the mean concentration of uric acid for those of us that do suffer from gout in the midst of a gout flare is about 8.3 mg per deciliter. This number matters because the reference range for a gout attack is between 4 and 8 mg per deciliter. So most people, when they're suffering a gout flare, are suffering that flare at the top of the reference range, not outside it. All right, next, we have about 18% of those individuals are suffering a gout attack between 6 mg per deciliter and 8 mg per deciliter. So these guys are actually in the reference range. And extraordinarily, a full 14% of gout sufferers suffer a gout flare with uric acid values that are between 4 and 6, well within the normal range. So once again, what I'm asserting here from these statistics is that yes, uric acid is a requirement for the gout flare, but it is not sufficient on its own. There have to be other factors. Lastly, a really important fact here is that if you aspirate the joints of people with hyperuricemia, people with high uric acid, you stick a needle in the joint and you pull the synovial fluid out and you look in it, many of those individuals have uric acid, or to be more correct about it, sodium urate crystals in the joint, yet they do not have a gout flare. And I am getting some questions already, so be patient with me. I need to read those questions quickly right now, and then I will come back to the presentation. Okay, so this is great news. We have somebody who's done the blood test, and they're also measuring uric acid at home in this process. I'm going to come back to measuring biomarkers later in this presentation. I'm going to talk more specifically about the way of eating that I recommend for putting a gout flare in remission. Now, coming back to the presentation, you're looking at a slide right now that's super important because there has been previous work from a doctor. His name is Dr. Richard Johnson, and he literally has decades of work in this area. And he's developed a hypothesis that's called the fructose uric acid model of type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome. And at the center of this is the realization that when our liver encounters a large concentration of alcohol, glucose, and I'm going to refer to the glucose as a hyperglycemic event. This is where we're eating a standard American meal that is super high in glucose, so that when the glucose reaches the liver, there is a high concentration of it. In the standard American diet, people are also eating a tremendous amount of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, agave syrups, honey, and processed food. The one component that is common to all of those substances or mixtures is fructose. So fructose is really a heavy-duty molecule. When it enters the liver, it is immediately phosphorylated by an enzyme that is called fructokinase. And fructokinase does not have any feedback mechanisms. It's the consequence of converting the fructose, which is done quantitatively from fructose to fructose 1-phosphate, is that in order to phosphorylate this molecule, put a phosphate onto the fructose, we decimate the concentration of ATP in the cell. We also decimate the concentration of phosphate. The third thing that happens through a series of chemical steps is we cause the sudden acute rise in uric acid. And uric acid is driving mitochondrial dysfunction. It downregulates the nitric oxide pathway, and it activates the inflammatory cascade. There's clinical data on this, there are animal studies on this, and there are human tissue culture studies that support what I just said. Predominantly, the data I'm talking about came from the analysis of brain, liver, and kidney. Now, the question is, and this comes from the hypothesis that I've developed from Johnson's work, how do we translate what I just said to the joint? And predominantly in the joint, we're talking about a specialized biological cell, which is called the chondrocyte. Before I move to that slide, I want to emphasize to you what should have popped out of this slide at you was the sudden acute rise in intracellular, inside the cell, uric acid. And remember where we started with the statistics with this. We know that uric acid is at the center of having a gout flare. One thing I want you to think about, and this is what I'm proposing, is that there is a major difference between intracellular uric acid, what's going on inside the cell, and how it makes that cell sick, essentially, versus the uric acid that we have outside the cell in the circulatory system. So the effects that we're talking about are intracellular. They are the things that are happening inside the cell. So let's look at the next slide. So this is a representation of how I see the chondrocyte. The first thing to recognize is that for many of us out here, and if you look at my age group, I'm 63 years old, over 52% of us are diabetic. Approximately half of us are obese, and approximately half of us are suffering from cardiovascular disease. These are all diseases that have the root force that's driving this as insulin resistance. And in the last slide, we talked about this acute sudden rise in uric acid. We talked about mitochondrial dysfunction and the downregulation of nitric oxide and the elevation of systemic inflammation. This is, in fact, those three things, the driver, one of the central drivers of insulin resistance, which is the driver of all three, the big three, I call them, the type 2 diabetes, the obesity, and the cardiovascular disease. So as we move to the chondrocyte, what we need to make sure that we all think about is the fact that this is going on in the background of somebody who is eating the standard American diet. The standard American diet is comprised of standard American meals, which are extremely high in carbohydrate, usually include sugar. The dinner meal, on top of everything else, is going to have alcohol with it. And people are eating the standard American meal literally 5 to 6 times a day. This is clear cut in the literature. All right. You can find papers on this. And there are many people that are actually eating more meals than that. And we count a meal anytime they're putting something in their mouth. So 5 to 6 meals a day would count for all the snacks that are going on between the meals and so on. Anyway, what's the point? The point is that in these individuals, they all suffer from systemic inflammation. And the systemic inflammation is coming from the fact that each time they have one of these meals, they're introducing a hyperglycemic event into their system. A hyperglycemic event is being seen by the liver. But this is the thing to remember. This hyperglycemic event is also being seen by all the other organs and tissues that are in the body. And right now I'm focused on the glucose because in the chondrocyte, we're going to focus on the glucose. However, you got to remember that in the standard American meal, you're going to have not only the hyperglycemia there because of the high carbohydrate load, you're also going to have a high fructose load because on the standard American diet, people are eating significantly more sugar than they realize. We're looking at on a yearly basis somewhere over 150 pounds of sugar on average per US person in the States here. So now let's turn to what I think is going on and how we get to the gout flare. And then we'll talk about what you can do, I believe, to put gout in remission. So here you're looking at a chondrocyte. We have somebody has just had the standard American meal. If it's dinner, there's also going to be a quantity of alcohol that's involved in this. So in the synovial fluid, this is the liquid or the mixture of liquid and components that surrounds the chondrocyte. The purpose of the chondrocyte is to provide nutrients, proteins, and other biological factors needed for the joint to operate correctly. So the chondrocyte, let me back up. So the synovial fluid, the fluid that is surrounding the chondrocyte, has access to the circulatory system. So one of the things that is important to know with this that has come from studies that date into the middle 1900s, back into the 1927 is one paper that I found. We know that the glucose that we find in the synovial fluid, the fructose, the uric acid that would be coming from the circulatory system, other small molecules like free fatty acids and so on, are present in the synovial fluid at comparable concentrations to the circulatory system. So that hyperglycemic event that we're talking about that's happening during that meal is also a hyperglycemic event in the synovial fluid. That means that the chondrocyte is being exposed to hyperglycemia. Now, the other thing to understand about the synovial fluid and the chondrocyte is that this is a hypoxic environment. There's less pressure of oxygen. There's less, let's just put it this way, there's less oxygen in the synovial fluid than there is circulating in the circulatory system. That makes the environment where the chondrocyte is operating hypoxic. We also, so coming back to the food, right? So let's just very quickly review that situation. So we have a hyperglycemic meal, which involves a high level of carbohydrate coming into the blood supply, which is mostly going to be transformed into glucose and fructose, depending on how much sugar there was in there. It's possible somebody is having a meal that also has a high level of monosodium glutamate. That's what the word umami means. This is a seasoning that increases the richness of that food. And umami is important here because it also is a partner in driving the effects that we're now going to talk about. And the meal that I had prior to my gout flare was sushi and rice. There was high sugar sauces involved in it, high salt soy sauce. So I had the umami there, but I also had the other major components that I keep referring to. I had the alcohol, I had the hyperglycemia, and I had the fructose. This I call the deadly triad. So now let's look and see what's going on with this. So we have this hyperglycemic event. The chondrocyte is a specialist in glycolysis. What does that mean in English? The chondrocyte is a specialist in metabolizing glucose. That's what this means. So we have the glucose moving from the synovial fluid into the chondrocyte, where the glucose, once it's inside the chondrocyte, is going to fill the glycolysis pathway. Because we're in a hypoxic environment, because we have hyperglycemia, and we also have the umami, and we have high salt conditions, these are the exact conditions that activate a pathway, which is called the polyol pathway. So a significant amount of the incoming glucose that's passing from the synovial fluid into the chondrocyte is going to be converted from glucose inside the cell to fructose inside the cell. There is a recent 2015 paper that showed definitively that the polyol pathway is active in chondrocytes. So if fructose is metabolized in a chondrocyte, in a series of steps, we're going to generate a high intracellular concentration of uric acid, and uric acid is causing the mitochondrial dysfunction. It's activating the systemic inflammatory cascade, and it's significantly down-regulating nitric oxide, and it's activating the de novo lipogenesis pathway. What does this translate into? This translates into a chondrocyte which is sick. And there is even some evidence to indicate that the chondrocyte enters a program of cell death. And granted, there are different types of cell death, and I don't want to go there in this broadcast. Just the fact that the chondrocyte is sick and ailing, the result of that is that monosodium urate is going to be released from the ailing chondrocyte into the space, into the paracellular environment, the synovial fluid. There is an inflammatory cascade cytokine called IL-1 beta, which is also going to be pumped out. Those two constituents, so we have the monosodium urate and we have the IL-1 beta, they will activate the innate immune system. We're talking about macrophages and we're talking about neutrophils. The interaction of the macrophages and the neutrophils and some other factors that are in the synovial fluid will result in the inflammatory process that gives us the gout flare. So what can we do to put gout in remission? So I advocate for a diet that, number one, eliminates the sugar, high fructose corn syrup, agave syrups, honey, and processed food. Because if we eliminate those materials, here I am calling them materials. If we eliminate those foods, then we can decimate the probability of generating fructose endogenously, whether it's in the liver, the brain, the kidney, or in, for us, the chondrocyte. Next, by cutting into the carbs, lowering the carbs, we also lower the insulin expression. And when we do that, we become fat burners and we produce a family of molecules called ketones. One of those ketones is called beta hydroxybutyrate. And beta hydroxybutyrate is super cool because the literature has shown that beta hydroxybutyrate inhibits directly the NLRP3 inflammasome. In other words, we eliminate the sugar and the rest of that business. We cut into the carbs so that we eliminate hyperglycemic events. We've eliminated the fructose. Then on top of that, the benefit of the keto diet is that we also generate beta hydroxybutyrate, which from a different angle, right, is inhibiting the inflammasome and therefore the inflammatory process required for a gout flare. Now, what does the ketogenic diet for somebody who suffers from gout look like? So we're talking about being in the range somewhere here of around 5% carbohydrates. This translates roughly to not eating more than 50 grams of total carbs per day. And I'm going to talk about how to do that easily, because I know when I first throw it out there that this sounds super complicated, but it actually isn't the way I teach people how to do it. It's really simple to do. Next, we're going to have somewhere in the range of around 20% protein. Now, I say around because we know that protein is involved in gout flares because the protein can generate purines in the way that it's broken down. The question is, what is actually the influence? And my argument is that protein is secondary to the influence of the alcohol and the sugar, etc. But it can have an effect. And I suspect that it will have different levels of effects in different people because we're all different, right? We all have different metabolisms and genetics and so on. So how are you going to make this decision? When you start this lifestyle, you will have to tweak the amount of protein that you're eating and then use common sense about it. It's not a good idea to sit down and eat several tins of anchovies while you're swigging beer, right? That's what I mean. That would not be common sense because anchovies have a lot of purines in them. Usually they're also canned in a good bit of salt. And then you have the alcohol on top of that in the example that I'm giving you. So like you want a broad range of different proteins. Even if you choose to eat organ meats, it's the kind of thing that you shouldn't be doing every single day. So in this lifestyle, it's not black and white and it's not regimented. You're going to need to tweak these different things. How far down do I come in the carbs? How much protein am I going to be eating each day and what types, right? You're going to play around with that a little bit. And then lastly, we have about, we make the calories up, right? We're not on a calorie restricted diet. So we make the calories back up by adding fat. Specifically, we're eating natural fats. This is going to include ghee, butter, beef tallow, lard or bacon grease, olive oil, avocado oil, and coconut oils. We're not eating seed oils. No seed oils. Now, one of the main things, and I'm super psyched to see this from E. Stair in the comments here, is that biomarker monitoring is really important here because we are suffering from a condition that I assert not that much is understood about. And I believe in taking control of my own health. I'm not sure how you guys feel about that, but that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I want to teach you guys the same values that I have about this. Take control of your own health. One way to do that, I think that is very important here, is knowing what's going on. So the biomarkers that I monitor every single day are my weight, blood pressure, my ketones, blood glucose, and also my uric acid. I'm not showing the uric acid. Well, I'm showing it here on the meter. I'm not showing it in the little display screen because my app doesn't put the uric acid there, but I measure it every single day. Now, why would I care? Especially why would I care about things like blood pressure? Okay, so we've gone on a ketogenic diet. And when we do that, we should be producing ketones. That's the reason why I have the ketones here. And in other presentations, I've talked about the fact that as ketones rise in our circulatory system, the acetoacetate and the beta hydroxybutyrate are going to be excreted at the level of kidneys. And the beta hydroxybutyrate is an organic acid, and it will compete with the uric acid for excretion. So when you start the ketogenic diet, what's going to happen is you're going to see the uric acid rise. What is it going to rise to, and at what point will it start coming down? Because it will come down as you keto adapt, as your body changes over and learns how to burn fat, in contrast to burning carbohydrates. The way that you're going to know this is by testing your own uric acid. You can track the peak. You can track your process into keto adaptation. Why do you want to keep the ketones centered around 1? I don't have any good literature science for this. So what I'm going to tell you is anecdotal. For me, I find when I keep my ketones centered, how do you keep them centered there? This is going to depend on finding the right level of carbohydrates that you're eating, right? I said approximately 5%. You're maybe a little above that, or you're a little bit below that, depending on what you need to do. And I keep an eye on my ketones. And the reason I want them centered at 1 is because if I start going up significantly higher than that, I can see my uric acid rise. And why are you seeing it rise? Because again, beta hydroxybutyrate is competing with the uric acid at the level of kidney to be peed out. That's what's going on with that. Blood pressure is good to monitor because I believe there's some good evidence out there that uric acid is involved in blood pressure. And one thing that we do know is that as you go onto the keto lifestyle, we see over time blood pressure comes down. All right. And how are you going to know if it's coming down or not? You won't unless you're measuring the biomarkers. So I recommend measuring the biomarkers as you go through this process. Keto adaptation takes at minimum 2 to 3 months, but for some of us, it takes significantly longer. And there's good evidence out there by 2 scientists, Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek, where they see keto adaptation in elite athletes extending out at even 20 months. So I want to be careful here because I want to avoid being apologetic. There's a lot of us out here in this space who continually tell people, well, you'll start getting keto adapted right away. A couple weeks, maybe two months at the outset. That honestly is really misleading. It takes longer than that for most of us, and especially if we're older. If you're talking about someone who's 24 or 25 years old and has the metabolism, of a lion, I don't mean, I'm using that as a metaphor, right? They have this robust metabolism. Their response to keto adaptation is not going to be the same as it is for somebody who's 60, has prediabetes, markers for cardiovascular disease, and so on. For us, most likely it takes longer. So this is for the long run. This is a lifestyle. I want to just step away from this for a minute to answer a question. Okay, the question is, I hope you don't mind if I read this. It says, okay, my beta hydroxybutyrate has been around 3, so maybe I need to do things to decrease my ketones some. I would not be impatient about doing anything right now. If I read into this question and you just started the ketogenic lifestyle and you're in only a couple of months, I would just walk the line right now. And the reason I say that is because it takes time for keto adaptation to happen. And one of the things that tends to be true for those of us that get keto adapted down the road is that our beta hydroxybutyrate levels naturally come down. So I believe in patience. And what I tell the people that I coach is that, I believe in spending a year or two before I start reacting and manipulating. Just make sure you're within 50 grams of total carbs per day. Monitor things, watch the uric acid, watch the beta hydroxybutyrate, count off the months, get good at eating the diet, and look for when your ketones start to shift to lower levels. This seems to be a trend. For people that are veterans with this. Okay, I'm also being asked a question, any SNPs associated with the predisposition to gout? This is an area that I have not immersed into yet. So I'm not going to make anything up here. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that in terms of looking at the big picture, the gout, diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease, yes, there is genetic predisposition to these ailments. My philosophy about this is that what I believe to be true about this is that the genetics in a given person are worth about 15% influence. The vast majority of the rest of that influence is coming in the epigenetics. And what epigenetics means in English is the environment uh, that individual finds themselves in, right? And when I talk about environment, I mean, okay, what is the metabolic environment that person is in? What are they eating? What are they eating every day? What are the habits and so on that the liver, the brain, the kidneys, and the chondrocyte are seeing on a daily basis? What does that look like? And there are other factors involved in this, right? Which I'm guessing you probably already know. The quality of your sleep, right? That's going to influence this for sure. The amount of stress that's in your life, because one of the things I'm not talking about in this presentation is insulin. And we know that insulin actually hyperinsulinemia, so the overexpression of insulin, for example, due to this hyperglycemic event, also seems to have effects on the chondrocyte, right, that are not good. And I'm not prepared in this talk to go to the insulin question. But coming back to what I was just saying, the issue of stress is related to cortisol, right? And the cortisol definitely has an effect on insulin. And we know that insulin has an effect on the chondrocyte. And cortisol can also stimulate through the insulin and its interactions with the cells, right? Glucose. So you can see how all of these things tie together. And then the last factor would be exercise, right? And we know exercise affects uric acid. I've done the N1 stuff with this. I can go out and do a HIT, and if I'm simultaneously testing lactate and uric acid, I'm well aware that there is a spike, right? The lactate goes up, the uric acid goes up. Then the uric acid's going to come down. You also see a healthy uric acid rise. When I use the word healthy, I mean you're going to see a stimulation of uric acid in strength work. When I go out just for a walk, I don't see any real effect on uric acid. So anyway, what was the point of that? The point of that is that exercise has an effect. So when we talk about, when we start asking about questions about genetics, yeah, they definitely have an influence here. And I think when you look at diabetes, when you look at the big picture here, the gout, the diabetes, the obesity and cardiovascular disease, right? Because these conditions tend to overlap. Somebody with one generally is overlapping into another area. More than likely, what you're seeing there is how the genetics are influencing how they're dealing with their own global environment. So when I talked about environment, I meant, the metabolism, the exercise, the sleep, and the stress, all those things together. All right, let's see. I have another. The question is, did I already? Yeah, all right. If you look on this slide, you can see on the right, that's a uric acid monitor. It's called UA Sure. It's the one that I use. I know when I first started using this meter, there weren't really any other options on the market. And I know that there are now. I don't know anything about them, how good they are. I can tell you with this meter that it usually is within 1 mg per deciliter of a uric acid value that I get when I go to the hospital, or not hospital, sorry, when I go to my doctor and have a blood draw done there. I do this about every 3 months. I have a blood draw and I look at this whole cassette of biomarkers that I use to analyze my metabolism. When I have that done, uric acid is one of those things that I want them to quantify. And when I compare what I get on this meter, because I'll do my uric acid on this meter before I go and get the blood draw, and then I compare the numbers. And the worst that this meter has ever been has been 1 mg per deciliter. Quite often, it's It's literally right on the money with it. So it has good accuracy. The only thing is, well, never mind. The accuracy is great. It's pretty bomb proof. It's a good meter. Yeah. And I think it's uasure.com is what I want to say, but you can find it. They also sell it on Amazon. Okay, so I said earlier, this lifestyle is not that difficult to do, and I meant that. I teach uh, an intuitive way of eating with this. And what do I mean by that? So, how do you know if you're at 50 grams of total carbs per day? So, there are two ways that I know this. The first way is that I use metering. So, I test my glucose and my ketones before. Well, I don't do this much anymore because I know how to eat now. But in the beginning, I would test my glucose and my ketones right before I ate. Then I would test after I ate sometimes at a half an hour, then 1 hour and 2 hour. And most of the time I go at 1 and 2 hours. And I look and see what the glucose and the ketones are. I'm always wanting to see that I'm well within the range of the ketones. And that range should be between 0.5 millimolar and 3 millimolar. These days, I like to be centered around 1. But remember, I'm in my 4th year of doing this now. And I have literally 3 years worth of data. Now, what's the part about the eating? All right. So I teach the plate method. You split the plate into 3 parts. In 2 of the sections, you're going to have a fist size. Whoops, let me get my fist on there. Fist size sample or amount that you're going to eat of a green listed vegetable, keto approved vegetable. I'm in the show notes of this. They're not there yet, but in the show notes, I will make sure to include a food list there along with the password for you to get it. You don't have to worry. I'm not asking you for emails or any of the rest of the business, but you will have to click on the link and then you'll have to put the password in. And there's a downloadable PDF there that has the list of keto approved foods, not just vegetables, also meats and so on. So in 2 sections of the plate, just literally the way I'm showing it here, would be 2 green listed vegetables. So in this case, there's Brussels sprouts there and broccoli. There's a lot of different vegetables that you can safely eat in this lifestyle. And then 1 section of the plate is going to have protein in it. And you can think of the protein being approximately the size of a fat wallet, right? That a man carries in their back pocket. Or if you like, a deck of cards, if you're eating a little less. And again, you're going to be playing around with the protein. So when you eat a meal like this, looking at the plate, you test your glucose and your ketones in advance and then after the meal. And it's really simple because as long as those values stay within reasonable ranges, like I tend to eat so that my 1 hour glucose is not above 140, and then my 2 hour glucose should be under 100. And in fact, I'm really stringent, honestly. What I just said to you was pretty much the guidelines of the American Diabetes Association. At the 1 hour, I actually like to not be much higher than 110, right? And at the 2 hour, I prefer to be well under 100 at that point. And my ketones, I really like it if my ketones are never lower than around 0.7 or 0.8 in the meal. This way I know that I didn't overdo the protein, that my fat content of the meal was high enough, and that my carbs were low enough. So this is the thing. How do you know you're at about 50 grams of carbs per day? Well, if you keep your ketones in the range of 0.5 to 3, that's not going to happen if you're eating more than 50 grams of total carbs per day. I guarantee it. All right. You're going to be outside the range. And then what do? You have to troubleshoot things. Don't sweat bullets over it or anything, but you got to rethink, how much am I eating? Did I accidentally slip yesterday and eat a bunch of yams that my wife had on the table? What was the situation, right? It's a matter of troubleshooting the situation. But this is really easy. And as time goes on, you will have learned. and you're going to know pretty well intuitively what you can eat and what you shouldn't eat. You can apply the same kind of thinking here to eating in restaurants, when you go to social gatherings and so on. It's not that difficult. One of the challenges may be finding the range of protein that works for you relative to uric acid, but that really is a conversation for another episode. So here I just want to show you what I eat in a typical day. You can take this literally. All right. When I get up in the morning, the first thing I'm going to do, I might drink some water, is I'm going to check my biomarkers. So I take my weight. First I pee, then I take my weight. Then the next thing I do is I sit down. This should be done the same way every single day. I sit down in a comfortable chair, feet flat on the floor, and I take my blood pressure. I'm recording this into my logbook, or I also use Heads Up Health app to do this. Then after that, I usually will have three cups of coffee. And right now I'm drinking, I think it's Starbucks dark French roast that I make myself. Be careful if you're buying coffee off the shelf at the supermarket, because I discovered this summer that Folgers, the standard Folgers coffee, actually has sugar in it, right? And why don't you want that? You don't want it in there because it's going to activate the polyol pathway, and you're going to generate endogenous fructose, which is going to push intracellular uric acid up. So, again, how do you know the best coffees? Well, I just taught you in this video. Monitor the biomarkers. You can test your blood before you have your coffee and then after you have your coffee. And for literally with 3 cups of coffee here, my blood glucose won't be more than 3 units of difference. So like what I mean is, if I was to test my morning glucose, fasting glucose, and it comes in at 84 after having my 3 cups of coffee, it normally will be about 87, right? And my ketones, they will have gone up because in the coffee, I usually put a little bit of butter and some coconut oil. That's not a necessity. That just came over 3 years. I just started doing it. I like how it tastes. There seems to be no issues with it. And then the second thing is I eat my breakfast around between 10 or 11 in the morning. And I'm just illustrating that here. You can see 2 eggs and a steak on the plate. This is a metaphor. Usually I'll have 4 eggs, and I'm also going to have some type of breakfast meat. It could be steak. It might be last night's pork loin that I put on there. Or if we had salmon and there's salmon left over, then I have that. You might be wondering, really, Dr. Pete, 4 eggs? Don't forget that I'm a CrossFit athlete and I'm doing things every single day. At the minimum, I'm walking 2 to 3 miles, but usually I have some kind of high intensity exercise, or I'm doing heavy lifting, something like that. And this is the thing I want to put to you guys, is that it takes time for you to sort all this out. What are your needs, right? What do I need to do? And I have found that I need to elevate this morning meal in terms of protein and fat in order for me to get enough calories in order to be able to work out the way I do, which is pretty much I'm active every day, 7 days a week, right? So this makes a difference. And you are starting a new lifestyle, and lifestyle is not just the eating part. It's these other things too. And all of those are going to coalesce into some kind of an individualized program for you. The one thing that I want to do before I close, and if anyone out there has any questions now, you should pump them in here. The one thing I want to say to you before I close is that since I started the ketogenic diet, my gout has been in remission, except for 2 episodes. The first one was 4 or 5 months. I'd have to look back in my logbook after I started the ketogenic diet. So remember, when you first start, there will be a spike in uric acid. And my average uric acid in those days was between 9 and 12, right? I actually had some data. Maybe the next time I have one of these, I'll put that up front. You can actually see that. It's in some of my videos that are already published too. But as time progresses, like I said, and you keto adapt, that uric acid comes down. Now, the next time was I've been experimenting with allopurinol. And when in the first experiment that I did, and when I came onto it, I also suffered a gout flare. Uh, so, what is the number one lesson first? Number one, what I learned from this is that in keto adaptation, the gout flares that I had were nothing in comparison to before the ketogenic diet, right? When my first gout flare ever, it was a 10 on the scale of 1 to 10. I thought I'd broken my foot. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir right now. Whereas on the ketogenic diet, my gout flares have come in at a 1. Like I haven't even had the need to take ibuprofen for them, and I've continued to work out while I had them. I just know that I was because I had the throbbing and it was in the same exact joint, right? And then it went away after 2 or 3 days. So there is a difference, I believe, in what you would experience. But anyway, my point is that, once you're keto adapted and you're in remission, you also should have more resistance to a gout flare if you have them. It seems that most people, especially the ones, this is the feedback I get, who really are having problems with repeated gout flares coming frequently, is they seem to have some pretty frequent gout flares when they start the ketogenic diet. The main thing is to get through that however you can and get keto adapted. And remember, this is not a pill. This is a real, honest to God lifestyle change. And it takes work. It's scary. And for some of us with alcohol problems, it requires dealing with that issue too. And you're talking right now to somebody that has one of those. So it's like, because if you go back to the alcohol, I'm just going to tell you right now, alcohol is the most profound substance that you can ingest relative to getting a gout flare. It is a triple whammy in driving that. Fructose, for all intents and purposes, is just as bad, but I think that alcohol has an edge on it. So in any case, going forward, the key is to get keto adapted and to get, well situated in the lifestyle. And then, like I've tried to point out to you guys, that as time progresses, then you can experiment with things that you're eating and you can gauge what's going on with whatever the joint is that's been offended, by the gout in the first place, right? Because that's where we tend to get the gout flare again, and see what's going on, right? This is a matter of trying. You have to be willing to experiment a little with yourselves to find exactly the right place that you need to be with this. So with that, yeah, okay. So the question is about the both the alcohol and the allopurinol. So if you're just starting allopurinol, I've experimented with that, and here's what I can tell you anecdotally, right? And this also, there's basis for this in the literature, and that is that when you start the ketogenic diet, because of this spike, right? That's one place where you can have a flare. Let me just back up. I'm thinking too many things all at the same time. All right. So on the allopurinol, when you start that, what's going to happen is you're shifting the circulatory uric acid down. Most likely you have crystalline uric acid in the joint where you usually have the gout. That whole system's going to have to re-equilibrate. What does that mean? It means that probably some of that uric acid in the crystal is going to have to be released in response to the decrease that you have going on in the circulatory system. And I have found, and I believe this is part of the hypothesis, so I don't have any data for this yet, that other people have published. But I believe your greatest risk to a gout flare is when the uric acid that is in that joint is fluctuating, either a sudden increase or sudden decreases, and not so much about the static, uh, let's just call it the static presence of those crystals, right? The static presence alone, I don't believe is causing the gout flare. I think it's the shift and the interplay between the chondrocyte, the chondrocytes, and the innate immune system. And there's something in that dynamic, right, with the MSU, the monosodium urate, that is activating that flare. So if you're just getting onto allopurinol, just be aware that you could have a gout flare, um, and do the best you can with it, because I think down the road that this is the way to go. I believe that. I'm not a medical doctor. This is not medical advice, but I'm trying to find a way in this world to be free of the pain and not deathly afraid every single time I put something in my mouth, right? Okay, with that, I'm going to close. I hope you guys have a really, really good day. And next Friday afternoon, I will either be releasing a content video or we'll be live again right here on YouTube, Facebook, um, and LinkedIn. All right. So you guys have a great day, and I will see you next week in one form or another.